cause anxiety. I mean, a few years ago, a chap came up to me and said, I don't get 8 hours of sleep. Am I going to die? And I said, well, yes, I can tell you you're going to die, but it may not be related. And I think we've gone almost in 20 years from being, being more sensitive about our sleep now to having sleep anxiety. There's a condition, where people get so anxious about not getting their sleep, and if they wake up not getting back to sleep, that they don't. And it raises, I think, the really important point that we're all variable and our sleep will change as we age. So we need to be sensitive to that. And that most people don't actually have a sleep problem. They have a stress or an anxiety problem, which prevents them getting the sleep that they need.
What are your feelings about all of the sleep quantified self trackers that have come about? You've been doing this for a long time. I imagine there's just a whole swath of new data coming in, maybe some of it of variable, questionable authority. But are you excited about this? Optimistic? What do you think tech and gadgets might hold for the future of sleep research?
Okay. I think, it's a very important issue. And why could self-trackers be useful to most of us? Well, in the same way that you can use a set of scales to show that you've lost weight, which reinforces the fact that your behavioral change is getting what you want. So it's a positive reinforcement. Many people don't get the sleep that they want, and they need an independent value on their sleep. And so if these devices were accurate, you could say, I've changed my sleeping, my approach to sleep, and actually, yes, last night I got more sleep. So potentially they could be useful. And of course, in the lab, we use validated sleep trackers and other measurements of sleep and circadian rhythms. The currently available commercial devices are really pretty inaccurate compared to lab-based tests. In fact, they're not even particularly good. I think it's something like they're only about 70 to 75% accurate in telling you when you went to sleep and when you got up. And when they start telling you about whether you had REM sleep or non-REM sleep and all that sort of thing, they can be very inaccurate and they can cause anxiety. I kid you not. One person came up to me and said, I'm really worried I'm not getting enough slow wave sleep. And I said, well, what's the basis for this? He said, well, my tracker's just saying, I'm just not getting any slow wave sleep. And he said, I'm so worried about it. What I do is I set my alarm clock for 3 o'clock in the morning to wake myself up to check how much slow wave sleep I mean, that's the kind of anxiety that these things can develop. And that's what I'm kicking back against. I think they can be some fun. I remember chatting to a pair of identical twins, and they had the same sleep tracker. And they'd ring each other and say, oh, how much slow wave sleep did you get last night? Or, oh, I got more. And so they used it in a kind of jokey, competitive way. I think that's fine. But when it starts to actually make you anxious or worry about your sleep, then they can be harmful. Now, and it's worth bearing in mind, none of the sleep foundations and societies will endorse any of these current devices, and none, to my knowledge, have yet been FDA approved. So bit of fun. Don't take them too seriously. They will come. I mean, the problem is, how do you develop such a device? Well, you collect a bunch of information, and we're getting better at collecting information, whether it's heart rate, whether it's core body temperature, whether it's movement, and then what you do is develop an algorithm that synthesizes all this. And then and that's great, but the algorithm is going to have to change. You're going to have to put in a whole bunch of factors that you're now 80 and not 30. And amusingly, when you kind of look at the so-called medical validation of these devices, it's basically, a dozen California undergraduates have been put in a sleep room for a night, and of course, again, it's this whole concept of one size doesn't fit all. So I'm negative about them at the moment, but I do see their value, and I think they could be really important going forward.
Yeah, I went in for a formal sleep study probably 3 years ago, and it was very, very complex to get approval from my insurance. I, had to get somebody to watch the kids. It was really quite an ordeal, and I'm strapped into this thing.
Yeah.
And I realized, I'm 1 in 1,000. People are they're going to be, having apnea 300 times a night before they're going to do this, because it's a lot. It's a lot of, you have to take a lot of agency. So that's why I get really excited about the potential. But you're right, I wear all these crazy things, and I mostly ignore the REM sleep, because I compare them and they're not really matching up. But what for me, what was really helpful is it's just this honesty check. It's sort of like if you ask people how many times they exercised last week, everybody says like twice, when really it was like twice a month. If you ask me how much I sleep, I'm like, yeah, about 6.5 hours. And when I started tracking, it was pretty consistently 5.5, 5. And just that honesty meter, it's sort of like, a food journal or anything like that. You kind of look at it and you're like, okay, this is what happened. Just the facts. And just that for me was one of the best sleep coaches I've ever had. But I'm excited just about the democratization of data. So that kind of data, that sleep study test, this is part of the reason I think so many people are getting diagnosed with sleep apnea, is there's just more accessibility to test and awareness and diagnosis. But I wanted to touch on that. Everyone I know seems to be getting CPAP machines or jaw things for sleeping. What's happening with this boom in sleep apnea?
Well, it is. You're right, and it's very important to get it checked out. And I think that it raises a whole bunch of issues. I mean, if your partner, for example, is snoring and is showing signs of sleep apnea, it can be really distressing on the individual. And there are a number of solutions. I mean, if it's obstructive sleep apnea, then CPAP, it works in 95% of people. It takes a bit of getting used to, but that's the route to go, not surgery and not, other stuff. So it's fixable. And I think people are now probably much more attuned to taking this stuff seriously and listening to that. It's very interesting. Many partners say, you really snore. And so it says, of course I don't. You're just making it up. It's just you can't sleep properly. And of course, now you can go and you can get checked and you can get it sorted out. If it's snoring, it's actually almost more of a problem because and what I suggest to people is, if you have the opportunity, sleep in an alternative space. It is no reflection on the quality of your relationship. I remember, particularly in more elderly couples, they'll say, oh, no, it's the beginning of the end of our marriage. We've slept together for 30 years. I'm certainly not going to change habits now. And I said, well, no, you need to think of it in another way. It's the beginning of a new relationship. If you get better sleep, you'll have a better sense of humor. You'll be more empathetic. You'll be, a better kind of person. You have a better relationship, and so don't dismiss it completely. And so it's tricky. I mean, again, from a public talk I gave, a lad in his mid-20s came up to him and said, "How old do you have to be before you can sleep in separate rooms?" Because his bed partner was actually not snoring, but they moving around,
kicking around,
and so there is this sort of kind of guilt about if you're in a permanent relationship and you want to sleep in an alternative space. But that's no reflection at all. But Lucas, I think you raised another interesting point, which is, why do we need to depend upon these devices? It's kind of straightforward about how much sleep do I need? Well, if you're functioning optimally during the day, you can, you're firing all cylinders and doing what you need to do. That's great. If you need an alarm clock or somebody to wake you up in the morning, that's suggesting that you're not getting the sleep you need. If you oversleep on free days, and particularly on holidays, again, that's a sign you're not getting the sleep you need. If you're feeling sort of sluggish, it takes you a long time to wake up. If you crave caffeinated drinks during the day to keep you awake, if you need a nap, all of those sorts of things. And if you see changes in your behavior, like you do stupid and unreflective things, you think, my God, I'd never have done that normally. All of these can give you a sense of that you're not getting the sleep you need. And again, it's listening to partners, work colleagues, friends saying, are you okay? Your behavior seems to be, you're more irritable, you're less empathetic, you're not kind of the wonderful, lovely person I knew a few years ago. And so you do need to listen to those individuals. And I have to say, that collective information is going to be more accurate than the currently available sleep apps. And it reflects the fact that, you know, the sort of basically the safe, as it were, range of sleep, or the normal healthy range of sleep, it can be as low as 6 hours in some people and maybe 10 and a half, 11 in others. Again, 7 to 8 is the average, but you may be, you know, on those extremes. In the same way that there's genuine a basis to whether you're a morning person or an evening person. It'll be by your genetics. It'll also be how old you are. People in their late teens, early 20s will want to go to bed on average 2 hours later than somebody in their late 50s, early 60s. There's a real change. And the third factor, which is important because that's the one that's modifiable, is when you see light. Morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier and go to bed earlier, whereas evening light delays the clock, makes you want to go to bed later and get up later. And we showed in a study a few years ago, we looked at university students all around the world, and that the later the chronotype, the more owl-like they were, the less morning light, making you get up earlier, and more evening light, making you get up later they got. And so if you are a late type and you really got to try and get up earlier, then set the alarm, use a light box if it's not bright enough outside, and you can advance the clock and make things a bit better.
So I always am confused. Is this chronotype research, is this legit? The fact that some people are just morning and some people are evening, and does this change? Is it different when you're 80 than when you're 8? Or
yeah, absolutely, it's certainly legit. And one of the exciting things with the understanding of the molecular nature of the clock, you know, subtle changes in some of those clock genes have been associated with morningness and eveningness. In fact, you know, there's one change in one protein has been associated with a condition called familial advanced sleep phase syndrome. And those just one change in the protein, tiny change in the protein, those individuals are going to bed at around about 7 p.m. and waking up about 4 a.m. Their whole clock has advanced in time. So there's a genetic basis. There's also a developmental basis. And so from the age of 10 through to the early 20s, there's a sharp rise in wanting to go to bed later, and then a slow move to a more an earlier bedtime as we go into older age. And that almost precisely follows the line of the sex steroids, sharp rise during puberty and a slower decline into old age. But as I say, on average, somebody in their late teens, early 20s will want to go to bed about 2 hours later than somebody in their late 50s, early 60s. So teenagers aren't lazy. Yeah, well, yes, and we all know lazy, yeah, that with a qualifier. But there is a part biological basis for this.
Is this part of why, as people get older, the stereotype, which is often true, is people go to bed earlier, wake up earlier, and they sleep so little? You know, as I remember my grandparents, by the end of their life, I swear they sleep 5 hours a night. It's like, it seems like they would need more. Is that part of the sex hormone decline? Is that related, or is that a different pathway?
There's certainly that change or that correlation. But what we do know is that the robustness of the circadian drive. So, you know, young middle years have got a nice high amplitude 24-hour oscillation. But as we get older, that amplitude decreases and it produces less of a stronger drive for sleep and wake, which is one of the issues. And it's nicely mirrored with some of the hormones which will affect sleep. So, for example, hormones associated with urine production. You know, urine high during the day, should be low at night. Well, of course, the circadian drive for those hormones has diminished. So you're going to produce more urine at night, which means that you're going to probably have to get up more. And often also, you've got to be slightly careful here, because often it's not that you want to get up and pee that wakes you up. It's that you have lighter sleep. You're aware that there's urine in the bladder, so you then go and pee. One other thing in the while we're talking about urine, that is interesting in the elderly, and particularly those in sort of nursing homes, for example, if you're sitting all day, and also you may have you're not doing any exercise, and you may have blood pressure issues, then sort of blood will pool in the lower limbs, the whole puffy ankles, the puffy lower legs.
Yeah.
When you lie flat, that fluid, the plasma, then is reintegrated into the body. Because what happens is it sort of whooshes in, the blood detects, my God, blood pressure's gone up. I need to start peeing to get rid of this fluid. And just by lying down after a day of no activity can generate 1 liter of urine. So that's why it's so important that the elderly are kept mobile, because that will improve their sleep, because it will mean that there'll be less urine production at night. So a lot of the elderly worry that the fact, I wish I had the sleep I had when I was 30. You're not. It's going to change, and you should stop worrying about it. So my mum was a great example of that. She said, I've never had the better sleep in my entire life. I don't have to worry about work. I don't have to worry about you kids. It's so much better. And by the way, don't call me before 11 o'clock in the morning. She adopted a pattern of sleep that worked for her. And very amusingly, when she moved house, and her bedroom faced, there was another house somewhere over the road, but the little old lady in the house opposite said, you were up late this morning. I didn't see your curtains go back until 11 o'clock. And this incensed my mother, so she moved into the back bedroom where there was no social criticism about when she got up. And so, I think it's as long as you're feeling great during the day, then you should adopt it. And the problem is that many of the elderly, and again in nursing homes, are sedated. They're given the Z drugs. And this, I think, is very and in fact, the clinical recommendations are that the costs outweigh the benefits. You shouldn't do it because one, if you need to get up in the night, and we've talked about that, you're going to have a greater chance of falling. And of course, a fall is often extremely dangerous because it then triggers a whole cascade of health issues. And also it can increase daytime sleepiness. And one of the problems that I think the elderly face is that they're sleepy during the day, they have a long nap, which can be close to bedtime. That pushes back the sleep pressure, and that can affect sleep at night. So yes, the occasional nap is not a problem, but making sure that it's not part of the sort of the daytime routine, I think, is important. But bottom line is, again, as long as you can do the things that you need to do, and you're feeling happy, and you can process the information that you need to process, don't worry about it. You shouldn't develop anxiety about it. It will be different, but different isn't necessarily bad.
I want to ask you about mental health. We have a number of people joining us live. Everyone joining us live, drop in the comments down below. Tell us if you're a morning person or evening person or both like me. I just don't sleep well. And if you have questions, feel free to drop them as well. I want to chat about mental health because you mentioned this idea of having a warning label on shift work, having a procedures in place, safety protocols, checklists. With mental health, whether it's clinical depression or anxiety, debilitating, the really serious stuff, this also rarely comes up, at least from my experience. In my younger days, I was on SSRIs and went through all kinds of things, and no one ever asked me about my sleep. And obviously, when things are bad, you need treatment. But in your research, what have you found in terms of connection between sleep problems and mental health issues?
Such an important area, Lucas. And I was in an elevator with a psychiatrist who said, "Oh, you work on sleep, don't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, kind of." And they said, well, my patients who have schizophrenia, they have terrible sleep. That's because they don't have a job. So they go to bed late, get up late, miss my clinic, and don't have friends. And I thought that was one of the most stupid comments I've ever heard. So that triggered. It's amazing how irritation can trigger a whole line of research. So I got together with another psychiatrist, and we looked at her patients with a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia and compared them to a cohort of age-matched unemployed individuals. And I have to say, it's one of those pivotal moments in one's career. We looked at the sleep-wake profiles of these individuals with schizophrenia, and they were smashed. They were absolutely smashed. And we also, when I, working with Guy Goodwin, we also looked at kids at low risk versus high risk of developing bipolar. They had no clinical diagnosis of bipolar, but when you looked at their sleep-wake patterns, the ones at high risk already had a disrupted sleep-wake pattern. And so this sort of crystallized in my mind, well, hang on, what's happening here? Because everybody says, is it chicken or egg? And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. If you think about all of the neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep and circadian rhythms, it's essentially everyone in the brain. And so the argument was at the core of the association between mental health and sleep abnormalities, there's an overlap in the mental circuits, the circuits in the brain. And of course, if there's a change in one neurotransmitter, let's say dopamine, that predisposes you to a mental health issue, it's going to have an effect upon sleep at some level. So there is a mechanistic overlap at the core. However, the change in the sleep pattern, because of its broad physiological and behavioral impacts upon your health, could exacerbate the degree of mental health. And of course, the mental health can feed back and make the sleep worse.
Sure.
Bottom line
Chicken and egg.
Yeah. So bottom line is, if you can even partially consolidate sleep and circadian rhythm disruption in individuals with mental health, do you reduce the severity of the symptoms? And we now have, from studies led by Dan Freeman, a psychiatrist here in Oxford, empirical evidence that show that. There are individuals with poor sleep having hallucinatory experiences and paranoia, and by simply stabilizing the sleep, we were able to reduce the levels of paranoia and cognitive the whole sort of spectrum. And so I think we're at an exciting time where sleep was simply dismissed as an artifact of where you don't work, or poor sleep because you don't work, or the drugs you're on. We can now think of it as very valuable, not only as a predictor of perhaps a crisis, whether it's depression or bipolar, but also as a target to reduce the effects and therefore reduce the severity of the condition. So people who are sort of borderline with poor sleep and who slide into that state, we can bring them back, and it's by protecting their sleep. It's such an important point.
So Russell, for people listening, maybe they're struggling with a metabolic disorder, maybe they have a mental health issue, maybe they have food cravings, like we mentioned, and they're nodding their head and they're going, okay, it's sleep. And then, sleep better. Okay, go sleep. It's sort of like the diet and exercise thing. It's, you want to get healthy. Okay, obviously eat healthy food, go exercise. Okay, and then you don't. So what, from your experience, when people are listening to this and they're starting to connect the dots and realizing that, hey, maybe I have clinical depression, or maybe I have terrible sleep and I'm prone to clinical depression. Maybe I'm carrying a bunch of extra weight, or maybe I'm have bad sleep and that's bringing about a propensity to overeat, and they want to do something. Where do they go? I mean, where are they get help with this? Because they go lie down tonight and they're not going to sleep, or they'll go to sleep and they'll wake up at 3 a.m. They'll stay up, whatever crazy pattern people fall into.
It's a problem. In a 5-year training, most medics maybe get 1, 2, 3 lectures on sleep, and it won't be the sorts of things we've been talking about. That's why within the institute I established here in Oxford, we've got the first fully on master's degree in sleep medicine, so that healthcare professionals can get the information so they can then advise their patients. And that's what, so part of it has been missing. But what are we going to do in the meantime? And that's part of the motivation of why I wrote Lifetime, because everybody so many people think, oh, well, you get the sleep you get. Well, that's not true. First of all, there's 2 important messages, I guess, in the book. One is we're immensely variable and it changes as we age. And 2, there's a hell of a lot you can do about getting better sleep and protecting your sleep. And there's a big chunk of information on that. What I've done is I've divided the information up, and what can you do during the day? What can you do before bed? In the bedroom itself, and actually the bed. How can just the bed, change your propensity to sleep? And we could touch on a few points now. I mean, one of the key things during the day would be that morning light. Get that light which sets the clock. Some wonderful studies showed that people who own a dog have a better sleep. And that was the argument was, oh, it's a companion animal. I bet you, but I don't know. It's because you have to take the dog out first thing in the morning, and basically what you're doing is you're getting your exercise and your light exposure, which is actually setting the clock. Oh, sorry, is it testing? It'll stop in a second.
No problem.
I hope.
Yeah. So I'm stuck on this Masters of Sleep Medicine thing. So you're gonna have sleep experts who could help people potentially explore all the options, right? Whether it's bedding or temperature or pharmaceutical interventions or CPAP machines, whatever it might be, right?
Yeah. So that's really good. It's designed for healthcare professionals, and you have to have got a level of educational background so that you can do the stuff.
It's amazing.
And that's something. And we're now speaking to people all over the world, and the key thing is that it's healthcare professionals are immensely busy, so they download the lectures when they need it. We organize tutorials, and the tutorials in the UK may be, weird times for us, but it fits in with their schedules. And I think that's finally, I think, delivering that education, which I think is so important. And again, it's these sorts of things. But one of the key things, I think, for many people, at the end of the day, is try and step back from work. Just whether it's exercise, whether it's going for a swim, whether it's mindfulness, but it's actually trying to wash out all of the stress that has accumulated during the day. And as I said, most people don't have a sleep problem. It's an anxiety and a stress problem. So that's so important, I feel. And it's the other sorts of things. I think it's quite funny that for many couples, the only time that they can discuss serious stuff, well, there's time, is in the evening before bed. And at least in my household, we've banned that. We're going through a major series of renovations at the moment, and the costs are spiraling out of control. And we have banned, seriously, we just say we wait for the morning discussion because it's too stressful before you go to bed. And it's all of these things which can accumulate, and as I say, I discuss in the book. I mean, we touched on apps. Don't take them too seriously. We've touched on a snoring sleeping partner and ways of dealing with that. I think there's a lot we can do, and it's all behavioral stuff. I mean, one thing you have to be careful about though is that people do become dependent upon the Z drugs, and if they're not on those prescription drugs, then they'll go and take the drowsy antihistamines, and that's really bad. I mean, they can. I mean, there's some of these drugs I, heard about them, so I sort of tried it. I took one on a Friday evening, and I was wiped out for half of Saturday. They can be extremely powerful and really try to do everything other than medications. Take possession and change your behaviors or your exposure to environmental triggers. And that's always got to be the first line of defense. Now, clearly, some people will need short-time Z drugs or something like that. But try and limit the duration.
It's such a great message because some of the things we've talked about sound really simple, like what you just said, setting a limit in the bedroom. It's funny you mentioned that. I literally last night had the final discussion. I said, we're not doing this anymore with my partner. It's been an ongoing thing. And also, the whole bed divorce thing. It's like people really need someone to actually, a coach, a medical doctor, a therapist, somebody to say like, this is okay. Like in my house, if I'm too hot, I might switch beds, and it's a major thing. Like, are we okay? Is our relationship falling apart? And I could really use like a clinical professional to say, this is normal. People do this. It sounds like a small thing, but what most of us do is we just lay there sweating, not sleeping for an entire summer instead of exploring like options. And, don't even get started on CPAP machines. People are so scared of having this gizmo next to their bed that instead they're having, 300, 400 episodes a night, because, somebody there's nowhere for people to go and just sit down and say, hey, this kind of thing happens, and here's the options. If you don't want to go for the CPAP machine, you could look at these kinds of things. So I think it's one of these things that we feel, we say sleeps like a baby. It seems like so natural, and yet it's not natural. So we need help. Like there just really aren't that many resources.
Well, you're right. And again, we've sort of dismissed it. And we've also taken away that kind of pre-industrial intuitive love of sleep. Shakespeare, the honey, what was it? Sleep, sleep, nature's soft nurse. How have I frightened you? The honey heavy dew of slumber. I mean, we embraced it intuitively. And then because of industrialization, we've said it's sort of, and you're too young to remember the 80s, but it was sort of, it's almost like an illness, needing a cure. And people would come in and say, I've done another all-nighter. And you think, why would I want somebody who's overly impulsive, aggressive, lacking in empathy, and not able to make sensible decisions in the workplace? But that's what you get.
Russell, it's a great conversation. Tell people where to find your book and what you're excited about for the rest of the year.
Well, Lifetime is published by Yale University Press in the United States and Penguin in the UK. It's coming out in paperback actually fairly shortly in the US. It's out in paperback in the UK. The objective of the book is essentially to try and unpack the science of sleep and circadian rhythms and to provide people information about where they might want to change their sleep. There's the evidence base for it, and it's not too heavy. But what's important is that the publishers have allowed me to put the scientific references in. So this will put everybody off, but at the back there are 920 references. So if you want to go to the science underpinning these sorts of statements in the book, you can. So that's the book. What excites me and what I'm really, really into at the moment is, I mentioned the fact that we've discovered these new photoreceptors in the eye, regulating the clock. And now we're developing drugs to fool the clock it's seen light. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, if you have no eyes, like our veterans, and we're working in veterans both in the UK and the US, then, of course, there's no way that the internal clock can align itself with the external world. And so you're drifting through time. And what we've done is got the preclinical work, and we've actually shown that this drug is safe in humans. And now we want to go on to the clinical trials and essentially give back those individuals a sense of time. And what if you don't have eyes or they're radically damaged, it's not only do you don't have the sight, but you don't have any sense of time. And you hear these chaps saying, I feel as I'm constantly being tricked by my body, which is another massively undermining thing on individual confidence. One chap told me, look, I'm going to be as independent as I possibly can. He's completely blind. He'd worked out a way of going to the shed to get the lawnmower out, to cut the grass. Couldn't see any of it, but he was determined that his house would not be the untidy house. And then one day, one instance, his wife came down. It was 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "You've got to stop. You're waking up the neighbors." And just it's kind of funny, but you think how distressing that is. So we're hoping to take this drug into clinical trials. And if I can end my career by giving back a sense of biological time to this group, but also others, people with neurodevelopmental conditions, children, for example, have terrible sleep-wake patterns, Alzheimer's, dementia, also terrible sleep-wake patterns. If we can partially stabilize the clock and therefore the sleep-wake in those individuals, that'll, I think, be really exciting. And it's based upon the fundamental science that we've discovered of how light is changing the molecular clockwork. So it's not, kind of remedies and brews. It's science-based, evidence-based approaches.
So if I understand correctly, it's like light in a pill, basically.
Yeah, that's it. We may use that term.
And so if somebody's stationed in Antarctica or on a submarine, still potentially very, very useful, right, for helping people.
Right. It could, so it could help synchronize, under different circumstances. That's right. So we're really excited about it. Yeah. So that's
amazing.
That's how I'm going to spend the rest of my year, and amongst many other things as well. But that's the key thing. Yeah.
I appreciate you coming.